I'm also the program director for the Santa Cruz Sexual Assault Response Team, also known as SART for short. I am excited to welcome you to our virtual conversation discussing the film, The Bystander Moment, Transforming Rape Culture at its Roots. Claudia and I previewed this film a few months ago at the suggestion of Anne Simonton. We were struck by the paradigm shift presented by Dr. Katz and its potential to transform not only rape culture, but also its potential to shift individual and collective action at all levels. Sexual assault in a traditional framework is largely viewed as a women's issue, and response to sexual assault by definition is after an incident has already occurred. The paradigm shift to a root cause approach using education and empowerment, including and largely focusing on men's voices and actions, prompted us to want to find a larger audience in our community that we could engage with. Communication and education are drivers for change, and thus here we are. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. It is my pleasure to introduce our first guest, Dr. Jackson Katz. Dr. Katz is a major figure and thought leader in the growing global movement of men working to promote gender equality and to prevent gender violence. He is the founder of the Multiracial Mixed Gender Mentors in Violence Prevention, also known as MVP program, one of the longest running and most widely influential gender violence prevention programs in North America and beyond. He is the author of numerous articles and 2 books, including The Macho Paradox, Why Some Men Hurt Women and How All Men Can Help. He is the creator of the award-winning Tough Guys educational documentary series, as well as our video around this event, The Bystander Moment, Transforming Rape Culture at its Roots. Jackson has appeared in numerous popular documentaries, and his TED Talk, Violence Against Women is a Men's Issue, has over 4.8 million views. He has lectured and trained in all 50 states, 8 Canadian provinces, and every continent except Antarctica. And I'm sure there's potential there as well. Thank you, Jackson, for joining us all the way from Boston, Massachusetts.
Wow, thank you so much, Lauren. It's great to be with you and your colleagues in Santa Cruz. Thanks for inviting me. I want to also thank Claudia for her, inspiration and leadership and advocacy. Claudia and I are the first made contact, early on in this process. Thank you, Claudia. And Anne Simonton, my old friend and colleague. Thank you, Anne, for what you've done to make tonight possible. But also, Anne is a longtime, sort of stalwart activist in the field and feminist activist, and her Media Watch organization is way ahead of the curve in terms of understanding how media narratives and representations of especially of women, but not exclusively of women, across race, class, ethnicity, and every other category, helps to shape perceptions about women that undermine women's strength, undermine women's agency, and Anne is way, like I said, a pioneer and way ahead of the curve. It's great to be working with Anne, so thank you, Anne. And I also appreciate that Sheriff Hart is going to be part of tonight's event, as well as sponsoring the event, and that's important because Sheriff Hart is, has a stature and an important position, and his participation in this event is important. So thank you to Sheriff Hart. This is a big day in American history. The guilty verdict of the former police officer Derek Chauvin in the murder of George Floyd back in May 25th of 2020. This is a very big event and moment in our history, and coming to terms with lots of different things. There's no way we're going to go into this tonight in any depth. This is not what this program is about particularly, although there's lots of overlap, but that's not what we're here to focus on. But I do want to acknowledge that this night's discussion is framed around, The Bystander Moment, my film that I made with my colleagues at the Media Education Foundation. And there's some real interesting overlaps between the bystander work that I and my colleagues do and some of the aspects of the murder of George Floyd. And I just want to give you a couple of pieces of that, and just for your edification, if you will, and then I'll move to my central subject, which has to do with men's violence against women. But in the 9 minutes and 29 seconds of, Derek Chauvin putting his knee on George Floyd's neck, there were 3 other police officers who were there during that whole time who did not intervene to stop what happened from happening. And my read on that, and I've written about this, is that it's more complicated than just saying they're all racists and they're all on board with an officer who is clearly, misusing his authority in that moment. And there's more going on in that peer culture that has to be understood. If you understand male peer cultures, and they're all men in this case, there's dynamics and there's hierarchies. And when Derek Chauvin, as I understand it, arrived on the scene, he was the most senior officer in that group. He was a training officer, and two of the officers were very, very new. One of them was on his 4th day on the job. These guys were young or inexperienced, and a guy comes in and takes control of the situation. And even if any of those three had been wanting to say something or do something, it's a bit easy to say from our comfortable chairs, if you will, that they should have jumped in. They should have said something, should have done something. Because if you really understand what goes on in male peer cultures, you understand it's more complicated than it looks. There's reasons why guys don't intervene. And I'm not talking about police now. I'm talking about more generally. There's reasons why men in peer cultures, young and old, professional and non-professional, civilian, military, and everything else, don't do anything or don't speak up or don't intervene when others on the outside might say, it's obvious they should have done something. It's obvious. When you look at the dynamics of the peer culture, you realize there's cost to pay if guys speak up. And people know it. Men know it, young men. Again, I'm not talking about police officers here, although it does apply to police officers. This applies much more broadly. Guys know, for example, that if they speak up, if they intervene when another man is abusing, for example, a woman in some fashion, or especially if it's subtle, not like an overt assault, but some subtle sexist commentary, guys know that speaking up or making clear that they're not cool with that comes at some risk to their status within the group. They're seen as disloyal. They're seen as not one of the guys. They're seen as virtue signaling. They don't really believe it. They're just trying to somehow show that they're cool or hip or allies of women, or somehow playing up to women, or what politically correct, whatever. There's a whole range of ways that men and young men keep each other from speaking up by making it clear that if you do, you'll pay the price. And when it comes to police culture, again, we could talk about that. We're not going to, but I'm just saying we could talk about how the dynamics within police forces and within military units and other groups of men who have to work with each other on a daily basis, who work within a hierarchy, they have all kinds of pressures on them not to say anything. I'm not defending the behavior. I'm trying to understand it. And that's an important distinction, because understanding behavior is not excusing behavior. And those three men are going to go on trial for enabling the murder to take place. So there's going to be an accounting for them as well. And there's going to be a national conversation that takes place about that as well. Okay, that's one piece. The second piece of overlap between the issues that we're talking about in terms of the bystander moment has to do with the young people on the street who were in a position to see what was happening, and they weren't passive. They weren't not saying anything. They were actually yelling at the police, at Chauvin and others, do something, the guy isn't breathing. They were yelling, they were taking video, a 17-year-old taking video, which, by the way, the reason why we're having this conversation and the reason why there was a conviction today was because that young person took out their camera, their phone, and videotaped that. That's not being passive. And so those young people on the street and others who were passersby, if you will, who stopped, who were trying to intervene, but of course they're not going to physically jump in, to armed police officers, but they were being responsible human beings and responsible citizens seeing an injustice. And if the officer, Derek Chauvin, or the former officer, had listened to those young people, guess what? We wouldn't be talking about this. George Floyd would be alive. The whole thing would have been avoided, right? I mean, it's sad and pathetic, but it's true. So having said that, and sort of given some context for the relationship between the events of today and of last May 25th, I'm gonna move to my central subject, if you will, and I'm gonna take you through this pretty quickly. There's a whole lot to get to, and not a whole lot of time. Number one, I just wanted to share with you sort of the driving force behind my work, which is, as Lauren said in her introduction, historically, the issues with sexual assault and domestic violence and sexual harassment and that whole range of gender violence issues, they've been seen as women's issues that some good men help out with. And I've never accepted that premise. I see these as men's issues. Men are committing the vast majority of the abuse, the harassment, and the violence. Whether the victims are women or men or others, the perpetrators are overwhelmingly men. It doesn't mean that women can't be and aren't perpetrators and don't commit crimes. Of course they do. But the overwhelming majority of violent crime and sexually assaultive crime is committed by men. That's a fact. It's not a debatable point. So why do we call, for example, rape a women's issue? Men commit overwhelming, like 99, or I don't know if it's 99, it could be 96, 97, 98% of rape, right? So if men are doing it in 98% of the time, why is it a women's issue? And in fact, the very act of calling it a women's issue is part of the problem. Because what it does is it shifts accountability off of the group perpetrating and onto the group experiencing the victimization, right? And that's not that's not coincidental. That's how power works. In this case, through shifting accountability off of itself. And it's amazing how this works. I think, by the way, calling rape a women's issue is a subtle form of victim blaming, because essentially embedded in that concept is that it's women's concern. Women have to deal with it. Women have to organize programs like tonight. Women have to do all the cleanup in the response and survivor advocacy and everything else. Why? Men are the ones who are committing the violence. And by the way, most men are not rapists, the vast majority. But why aren't more men out there? Why aren't more men organized around this? Why don't more men volunteer and professionally engage themselves with this subject matter? Anyhow, it's not any of it. None of it is coincidental. This is how power works, and frankly, in a male-dominated society. And then and part of what we're dealing with in our society at this moment in history is a struggle around reckoning with some of those realities, whether it's racism, structural or systemic, sexism, structural or systemic, and how we can better improve our democracy by advancing and breaking down some of the unfair, unjust systems of power and privilege. And by the way, let me just say, because I know that there are men here who are listening and who are participating, I don't see this as anti-male. I just think this is what men need to be doing. I think that men who care about justice and fairness and equality and human rights need to be speaking out about this stuff and need to be figuring out what they can do. I don't think this is anti-male for 1 millisecond. In fact, I don't feel guilty. By the way, let me just make this another point. I don't feel guilty for being a man. And by the way, you'll hear this from some men, not only men, but some men who hear men like me will say, well, there's just liberal guilt, or he's just trying to guilt trip men, and or white people who working against for racial justice, like white people who are out in the streets with the movement for Black Lives and such. You'll hear people say, oh, it's just white guilt, but I don't feel, it's just not about guilt. It's about responsibility. I don't feel guilty for being a man. I don't feel guilty for being a white person. I don't feel guilty for being heterosexual. That's who I am. But I feel responsible. I feel responsible as a white person in a racist society. Yeah, I do. I feel responsible for working for racial justice, or I feel like I'm a hypocrite. If I say I believe in democracy and then I don't work for it, then I'm a hypocrite, and I don't want to be a hypocrite. I don't feel, again, guilty for being heterosexual, but I feel like I have to work for LGBTQ, rights and inclusion and everything else, because it's just basic, fundamental to my beliefs in democracy and human rights. And as a man, I feel like I'm responsible in a society and in a world where the level of men's violence against women is just pathetic, and it's pervasive, and it's in every class and ethnicity and racial group. And it's way beyond time that we have more men who are willing to say these things. Because I feel like I've been saying them for a long time. Other men have been saying them, but nowhere near enough of us. Tiny number compared to the proportionately compared to the scope of the problem. So anyways, I honestly, powerfully, passionately believe that these are men's issues. And by the way, if anybody wants to make the argument, why do you have to say men's issues and women's issues? Why can't you just say, human rights, community issues, public health issues? Good luck with that. If you want to get men involved and you use gender neutral language, you're not going to get men involved. You have to say it directly. You have to say, this is about men. This is about men in positions of leadership and influence. You're not going to, a lot of men will say, human rights, that's great, I support that, and then move on. If you say, however, it's a men's issue, it's a leadership issue for men, then you get men's attention. Anyhow, that's one big piece. And by the way, language is so important in all of this. And for the sake of tonight, I'll just give you a teaser about how important it is to think critically about how we talk and think about this subject matter. Because if we want to get to this new paradigm, in other words, a new way of thinking that these are men's issues, that we need to include men in all levels, we have to think about how we're currently thinking. Because if we want to shift into a new conceptual framework, critically examining the current status quo of our thinking is a powerful way to do that. Here's a handful of examples of how we're currently using language that keeps us in the old paradigm. You'll hear people say things like, how many women on college campuses in the United States were raped last year, rather than how many men raped women on college campuses. You'll hear people say things like, how many teenage girls in various school districts were sexually harassed last year, rather than how many boys sexually harassed girls, or how many girls sexually harassed girls. You'll hear people say things like, how many teenage girls in the state of California got pregnant last year, rather than how many men and boys impregnated teenage girls. In each case, the use of passive language has a very powerful political effect. The political effect is the shift in focus off of the group with more power onto the group with less. Even the term violence against women is problematic because there's no active agent in the phrase. Violence against women is a bad thing that happens to women, but nobody's doing it to them. They're just experiencing it, kind of like the weather, right? But if you insert the active agent, men, you have a new phrase, men's violence against women. It doesn't roll off the tongue as easily, but it's more accurate, isn't it? It's more honest. And I think we need more accuracy, and I certainly think we need more honesty and more straight talk among men. And instead of being crouched down in a defensive, posture that a lot of men, find themselves in. Oh, what are you saying? I'm not a rapist. Not all men are abusive. We need to grow up. Okay, we need more men who are willing to say, you know what these women are saying is correct. It's an outrageous problem. It's been a problem for decades and centuries and millennia. And by the way, women are the primary victims of this form of violence, but so are men, so are children, so are kids, boys growing up in families who are traumatized by physical, by their father and another man's abuse towards their mother, towards themselves and their siblings. I mean, so many boys and men have been victims of all this. And if we care about them, we should be speaking out. And the jails of California, every other state, the prisons of every state are filled with chronologically adult men who are, many of them little boys, emotionally, developmentally, and relationally, who early on in their lives developed a kind of a hard shell, in part as a defensive reaction against trauma that they experienced from violence, often at the hands of men in their families and in their circles and stuff like that. I mean, all these issues are connected. I'm just saying that you can even have compassion for men and boys and be active on these issues, because the women in the battered women's movement and the sexual assault movement have been showing us a path for 50 years of how to get healthier, and not just healthier for women. Obviously, that's important and critical, but even for men and boys. I mean, a big part of the driving force behind my work is reducing violence. And most violence is done by men. And most forms of violence outside of sexual and domestic violence, men are the primary victims as well as the primary perpetrators, right? Derek Chauvin murdered, George Floyd. I mean, this is men murdering other men assaulting other men is a huge problem in the world and in our society. Men killing themselves, men shooting themselves in the head. I mean, huge problems in our society, and they're connected to the same system that produces men who abuse women. So we have to connect all of these things. And I hope that's clear that it can be done. It's not that, it's not that complicated when you get into the sort of specifics. Now, my work from the time that I was a young man in college around these issues, and it's been a long time, but I have always been trying to figure out how do we get more men involved with this. And by the way, I don't believe it's a volunteer thing. I'm an activist. We have to change systems and institutional practices. It's political. This isn't just about, more men volunteering for SART. I'm talking about much more systematic. Anyhow, we do need more men involved at all levels. And I started this program, the Mentors in Violence Prevention Program, and I'm fast forwarding because there's so many different pieces, but in the early 90s, that's almost 30 years ago. And we got funding from the United States Department of Education to create a model program that was engaging initially college male student athletes. And I was intentional on wanting to work with student athletes first, not because there was a problem in athletics of male athletes assaulting women, although there was such a problem, and there continues to be such a problem, but because I was trying to figure out if we get guys who already have some status to speak out, then it'll make it easier for other guys who don't have as much status. And it wasn't just about the insular athletics subculture, like on college and university campuses. It was about the larger campus community that looks to athletics, in this case, male athletes, in a certain enhanced way in terms of status. And so it was intentional to work with athletes. We moved into the military 4 years later, and then all the, in schools and every other setting that you can imagine, in corporate world, in the blue collar world, to a certain extent law enforcement, but not as much. Anyhow, the key innovation pedagogically, the teaching method that we employed was the bystander approach. And here's the sort of elevator pitch for the bystander approach. And if you haven't seen the film Bystander Moment, and hopefully you can see that, and you'll get even more background. Instead of looking at men as perpetrators and women as victims, or women as perpetrators and men as victims, or any beyond the binary, anybody of any gender or sexual identity as perpetrator or victim. In other words, it's moving beyond the binary. The bystander approach is a way of looking at everybody around the person committing abusive behavior and everybody around the person experiencing it. It's not just at the point of attack. It's not just getting people who are in the moment in a position to intervene in a situation of potential harm, like a rape in progress or something, or a domestic violence incident in progress. Intervene. It's anybody who's in a given peer culture or a community with people who are either experiencing abuse, harassment, or violence, or perpetrating it along a broad spectrum. What can they do? What can those people who are members of that community do to make it clear to the person doing the behavior that it's not acceptable, not because they're going to get in trouble with the authorities necessarily, or in a criminal sense, or the teacher or the principal in a school sense, or what have you, but because the peer culture itself is going to police itself. People in the peer culture are going to make it clear to that person who's acting that way, that's not okay. You're not acting according to the values of this group. We don't respect this behavior. We're not impressed by it. Stop it. And it's getting kids, or people, I should say, around the person experiencing the abuse to make it clear to that person that what's happening to them is not okay. We support you. What can we do to help you? The beauty of that approach in working with men is that a lot of men will say in response to this subject matter, oh, well, it's important, but it's an important issue, but it's not my issue. I don't rape women. I don't abuse my wife or girlfriend or other women. And some guys get some issues, but not me. I'm a good guy. And my response to that is, number one, we have to raise the bar a little higher for what it means to be a good guy in the United States in 2021. And just saying I'm not a rapist is not particularly impressive to me. That's number one. But number two, there's so much that men can do. There's so much that we can do that we don't do, that a lot of men don't do. Some men do, but a lot of men don't. And I'm just going to give you one example of a scenario, and then I'll stop because I know I've said a lot. But I want to just give you one concrete example of how to operationalize this concept. And it comes from a scenario that we use in the MVP model, the Mentors and Violence Prevention model. But it'll give you a way of thinking about the role of everybody in a given peer culture. And this happens to be from a professional peer culture, not necessarily students or young people, but it's professionals. So you're a man. And by the way, I'm talking about men and male peer culture. Women have peer cultures. Women play bystander, the role of bystander, which is another way, by the way, of saying friend, teammate, classmate, colleague, coworker. People who aren't men or women also play roles in all of this. I'm focusing on men, or people who identify as men. Think about this scenario. You're a guy and you're out for drinks after work with another couple of guys that you work with. So you're at the bar, three of you. One guy, your friend and colleague, coworker, makes a comment, a sexual comment about a woman who has recently been hired in the office. What do? So he's just made a comment about this woman who wants to be taken seriously as a professional in the workplace, and one of her new colleagues, she's not there, has just made an inappropriate sexualizing comment about her. What do? Now, what we do in the scenarios when we discuss this in the MVP model is we'll ask a series of questions, and there's more to it than this, but this is the heart of it. We'll say, who do you have a responsibility to? Let's think about your responsibilities, okay? Do you have responsibility, for example, to the woman? Maybe you don't even know her. She just started working. Maybe you do know her. Do you have responsibility to her? And what could be potential harm to her from this conversation? And do you have responsibility to do something about that? Number two, Do you have responsibility to the guy who just made the comment? He's your friend, he's your colleague, and you know that what he's just said could be bordering on sexual, sort of sexual harassment, but not, or at the very least, the fact that he would say that means that he might be someone who's crossing lines in terms of his professional conduct. And if he's your friend, do you have a responsibility to him to say to him something? I mean, because you care about him, he could lose his job. Number three, do you have a responsibility to yourself? And what does it mean to have a responsibility to oneself? And the way that I would frame that is, if you're a person who sees yourself as somebody who speaks up when you see injustice, when you see something wrong, when you see somebody's being harmed, well, this is what's going on right here, isn't it? And if you don't speak up and do something, in a sense, aren't you failing to live up to your own aspiration for yourself? And how do you get in line with your own aspiration? That's an important question, because ultimately you have to look yourself in the mirror, right? And the fourth is, do you have responsibility to the group, to the workplace, to the team, to the unit, to the company, to the organization? Because there's a certain shared ethos in the group of people. We treat each other with respect and dignity. And when somebody in that group treats another person in that group disrespectfully, in a sense, they're not just violating that person, although that they are doing that, they're also, in a sense, violating the group's values. And you, if you speak up, in a sense, aren't you speaking for the best values of the group? Because it's not just about you having a problem with his comment, it's about you being a representative of the group who's saying that this person is transgressing against the group's shared stated values. So the last point, so that's this is sort of ethical decision making. And then we talk about the options, what you could do potentially in the moment, later, the next day or 2 days later, taking him aside, talking to him and saying that you were uncomfortable with what he said. There's a whole bunch of options. The final point, and I'll stop, is the bystander who speaks up, with the friend, the teammate, the classmate, the colleague who sees something wrong. And it could be, by the way, a racist act, it could be a heterosexist act, and of course a sexist act, because this concept, as Lauren said at the beginning, transfers to all these other issues as well. The person who speaks up is actually a leader. That's a leadership act. When you speak up, you're actually taking a risk. You're saying something that you're often speaking for other people who haven't had whatever courage or strength or self-confidence to speak up. We need to identify that person as a leader. In male culture, we need to say that the men who speak up and stand with women and as allies and partners on this subject matter, it's not because they're soft or weak or politically correct. It means they're leaders, they're strong, they're people of integrity. And if we say that, we're challenging men in a positive way to rise to the better angels of their nature, because a lot of men want to be on the side of justice. Maybe they don't know exactly how in this context, but they want to be on the side of doing the right thing. And that's certainly true, by the way, in policing and law enforcement. A lot of people get involved in law enforcement because they want to help, they want to do the right thing, they want to help people, they want to, catch the bad guys and protect people. Well, this is related in a sense. And so I think just aligning people's actions, in this case, men's actions, with their stated beliefs is what we're talking about. It's not that complicated when you get down to it. We just need more men who are willing to take that first step. And I'm happy that I could share this with you in your event. So thank you for listening.